it goes. Days are only footprints in the snow. How far away can I walk till I'm way too far from home? I wish I knew, I wish I knew. I want something more than restless mornings. Getting by so boring.
Hi, welcome back to One Voices, and today we'll be talking about what it means to be an American.
I think being an American comes with like a lot of dark history that you do have to learn, and I also feel like it's super important to learn that we just don't learn sometimes because of our school system and stuff, which we've talked about before.
I think it's really impressive how like everyone is like in a sense connected to each other. Like although we kind of overlook other ethnicities, other race, and kind of any types of social group that we kind of ostracize, we tend to consider them as stranger, and we kind of really don't care about them as usual. But from learning those history, I think it's a really great chance for us to know not only like how our ancestry has like lived through those moments, but also how like other groups of people, other ethnicities, other like minorities especially, have gone through like similar history, and we have so many like parallels we can find.
I think with like Native American history is often like so like it's made to seem like it was in the past, so it's like, oh, we're exempt of blame. It was like so long ago, but it's actually like still happening even in like modern times.
And also the fact that it's not like taught as like modern history at all. Like in U.S. history, it just ends with the Mayflower, and then like indigenous groups are not like spoken of ever again, when in reality there are like indigenous people still like in America, and also there's like extreme poverty and also on the reservations, and just like never talked about at all.
Yeah, I feel like the government hides so much like dark history of the U.S. from us, and I feel like as Americans it is our responsibility to know like what we did that was not right, and to like admit it, because obviously there's no country that's perfect, but we can't just pretend that we're better than everyone else when we're like still having like genocide from like not so long ago.
Yeah, like genocide, it's really scary. I mean, the most like recent genocide that we are taught at least in school is Holocaust, and I mean still there are a lot of like, you know, death is around the world, like from war, for like Ukrainian war invasion, for example. But really, whenever we kind of like witness these history, it was like learning it from the text does not really touch us, but like having like the visual like record that helps us to really see what happened, I think is really helpful for us to really connect with the people who suffered from that events.
And like also to understand that none of this was natural at all. It was the government. This was systemic genocide and laws and Supreme Court rulings that affected groups of people. It wasn't an accident, nor was it natural. It was systemic, and the U.S. government did this.
In history classes, what we learn is that they killed the buffaloes to build a railroad, and that's like a sole reason like they provide like from the textbook. But really, like from the image we saw today, like a mountain of like buffaloes' skulls really it was,
I think they're
like,
bison. Is there a difference?
I don't know, bisons and buffalo. I don't know, like buffalo have like straight horns while bisons have like curves. I don't know. But anyway, like it was enormous, like the amount like they killed. I don't think that's even like healthy for their ecosystem too, like not only for Native Americans, but it was really destructive in general.
Yeah, and the sole purpose of the mass slaughter of these bison was only to terrorize the indigenous American population. So there really was no other purpose to kill all the bison. The fur and food wasn't used in any way, and this was sanctioned by the U.S. Army. So like the U.S. Army would give out free ammunitions and would pay bison hunters to go out and slaughter these bison, and it was essentially terrorism, really horrible form of terrorism.
Yeah, and also like how often like minority groups are pitted against each other. Like we learned with the model minority myth with Asian Americans and like the Black community as well, how they were pitted together, but also how like the indigenous or Native community is often was pitted or compared against with like the Black population, in that like you have to prove your nativeness on, there's like Native identity cards, and like the amount of like Native blood you have, it's like quantum blood, and like if you had like a family member got married to someone of a different race, it would like soil your pure Native ancestry, while the government wanted to dilute the Native population as like time moves on, while like for example like the Black population during slavery, any person that had like any Black ancestry at all at the time of slavery before emancipation could be enslaved in order to keep that workforce for free. So it's like this contrast in like keeping a working enslaved population while trying to dilute the Native population so that they couldn't claim sovereignty on their land and to get that free land. So it's like to get free labor and free land. And like what the government wants and what's convenient for the government, it's how race is categorized in this country is what is convenient for the government and their capitalistic purposes. And that's just an example of how it's systemic. And
I was actually kind of like surprised how they strategically divide those bloodlines to like 32 tribes, I heard. Like one of them was Apache, and it was like at the same time like diluting the Native population, and while really dividing even like within such minor group that like they promote a sense of like, in a sense, nationality, like pride within their own nativeness, and like kind of like putting them in a battleground where they just hurt each other, like even though they're like native together, but like in a sense they're really preventing those Native Americans to come together as a nation again and really make one voice, as they are currently trying to doing. And it's
I guess just to clarify, what we're referring to was known as blood quantum laws, and they're effectively ways that the U.S. government uses to define Native American status based on fractions of Native American ancestry. So, in short, what it is it takes the number of full-blood Native American ancestors that a person has and divides it over essentially all of their total ancestors. So a person who has one parent who's a full-blood Native American and one parent who has no Native ancestry would have a blood quantum of 1/2. And this is basically the United States government's method of essentially diluting the status and number of people who can qualify for Native American status, so that over time, when there are no more people who can qualify as Native American legally under the U.S. laws left, then these lands that were originally set aside for these Native American tribes, there will be no one left to claim them. So then the U.S. essentially can claim them as federal land and take them for themselves. So yeah, I mean, like you said, like we said before, basically how the U.S. sees race effectively boils down to what benefits them the most.
So interesting, because a lot of non-native people claim native heritage and ancestry, like Elizabeth Warren, for example, and also like recently in the census, like the Trump administration put this like question where it's like, do you have like native ancestry? And a lot of like white people said that they did, even though they don't have native ancestry. And like I think that's called like playing the Indian, and that's like, it's like, we talked very briefly about this in history class, but it's like how native identity is used to like construct American identity in a sense. Yeah.
I mean, well, definitely like white saviorism leads to like Americans teaching the Native American like what civilization is, and from there like they're trying to re-educate their children, especially by taking them from their families and putting them into like a weird school system where they can only speak English, they cannot identify themselves as Native American. So basically like by creating such place to like force assimilate them into American culture, really like, because they're not taught about their native history, it's hard to retain those identities, and it's easily forgettable. And secondly, like the scars that like the families get from it, like just the parents are too powerless to save their children from being like, just letting them be sent to their like schools to be taught about like American values instead of native values. It's a painful history for them too.
And like, this is colonization. I don't know why it's not framed in that way. It's like the colonists ended with the 13 colonies and then we became Americans. And it is colonization. Like, America is a colonizing state because like literally these practices of assimilation and putting children in schools where they're only allowed to speak English, like that is a colonizing practice. So like when I obviously I do know why they don't frame it as that, because they want to erase that history. I feel like they, meaning like people who write the textbooks, and also like it's only framed as something that happened in India or China or in other places like in African countries where like the British or the French colonized, and then there was decolonization movements, but like the indigenous populations were colonized too, and so that's what it is.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think like the situation right now is so complicated because, I mean, even from the beginning, America didn't recognize Native Americans as a nation, and they didn't like follow the treaties that they made themselves with the Native Americans, and because of that, like the standard of like Native population, like really, it's really ambiguous, like how we should pursue from current situation of managing this kind of thing. Like, I mean, those territories have long been really colonized by America that really nobody except the government could really like legally claim as their own land, although Native Americans have been trying to regain their sovereignty over their ancestral lands. And I think like I just have no clue how it's gonna like end up being. It's really, it was neglected for such a long time that it's really irreversible, like the whole thing, the whole history, and it's really tragic.
So like, to go back to essentially the assimilation of the indigenous children, for some specific places where this happened, there was the most well-known, or one of the more known areas, is Mohawk Institute in Canada, which was known as Mush Hole. And another one, which is actually very close to where we live, is the New York's Thomas Indian School, which actually, these schools, they were up and running up until very recently. For example, the Thomas Indian School closed officially in 1957, which is actually really recent. It's post-World War II, post-Bretton Woods, which is what we would consider to be the modern era. So it's really kind of shocking to think about how recently the U.S. was still attempting to assimilate indigenous American children, to try and deny them of their identities, basically.
Yeah, and I think like you have this whole, it's very complicated, and I think it requires like a whole way of rethinking like that we have, and like land ownership completely. And like, I hope we could get to a point where like the goal is not to create another like nation state like the US or something like that, like to rethink how nations are formed and to recognize like indigenous people's sovereignty.
Back to like what I said in the beginning about like how all ancestral histories in the United States are connected to each other, not like, for example, like indigenous people, black people, and Asian people. I think like what defines you is really like your history, you and your family, your ancestral lines, history, which are in a sense like really have like at least some kind of connection with other racial and like ethnical groups. That really, it's really important to know not only just your own culture but also the other cultures, and try to understand them and like connect it, so that like the identity is now like not divergent but rather like convergent into a single American identity. And yeah, I mean that's like the definition of like what it means to be an American for me, and I think that's what a lot of Americans still have to look forward to achieving.
Yeah, and I think like deconstructing this idea of what it means to be American, like you don't have to be a white cis straight man to achieve that. Like a broad definition of what it means to be American, because I know a lot of people of color like don't feel that, like they are encompassed in that. And like in the future, I hope that you can just be an American without like feeling you're excluded by law, or what the government defines that as, or what people like culturally or personally believe.
Well, thank you for listening to our podcast, and we'll come back next week with
or next time
or next month
with
a different topic. Thank you.
Yeah.